Let's examine how public opinion polls are conducted. In politics, public opinion polls are used for many reasons. Political scientist Herbert Asher noted, polling plays an integral role in political events at the national, state, and local levels, and in many major events or decisions, poll results are sure to be a part of the news media's coverage and the decision makers' deliberations. In addition, public opinion polls help determine who those decision makers will be. Candidates for public office use polls to determine their initial name recognition, the effectiveness of their campaign, their opponents' weaknesses, and how potential voters are responding to their message. Once elected to office, policymakers often rely on public opinion polls to gauge their constituents' opinions and to measure how well they are performing on the job. The process of conducting a public opinion poll consists of several steps. Those conducting the poll first need to determine the population they are targeting for the survey, the group of people whose opinions are of interest and about whom information is desired. So let's take an example. If your neighbor were considering running for the House, she would want to know how many people recognize her name. However, she'd be only interested in those people living in your congressional district, probably want to narrow it to those who are registered to vote, and then further narrow it by choosing likely voters, perhaps those who have voted in past congressional elections. The sponsor of any poll, whether a candidate, a political party or group, or a news organization, needs to determine what information is desired from survey respondents, because asking questions is a very tricky process. Sometimes this information is relatively clear. News media organizations track presidential approval ratings each month, for example, but other times this process might be more complex. Polling organizations construct polls carefully to ensure that the questions actually measure what the clients want to know. Pollsters also recognize that many factors, including question design and question order, influence their responses. Once the target population is determined and the survey measurement instrument or poll is designed, pollsters then must select a sample that will represent the views of this population. Because it is nearly impossible to measure all the opinions of any given population, pollsters frequently rely on random sampling, a scientific method of selection in which each member of the population has an equal chance at being included in the sample. If you remember back to the Prezi before, we talked about the fact that the Literary Digest didn't really have random sampling because their membership was people that were not of the lower and working classes. Relying on random sampling helps to ensure that the sample is not skewed so that one component of the population is overrepresented. To demonstrate this point, suppose Mr. Burkhart or Mr. Pavlovich asks your class to conduct a public opinion poll that will measure whether students believe that parking facilities are adequate at our school. In this case, the population you need to measure is the entire student body, but clearly, how you conduct the sampling will affect the responses. If you were only to ask students in your first period APUSH class or AP Gov class, you might find that they have little trouble parking because the campus is not crowded at that hour. However, if you were to ask students who attend classes later in the day, you might get a different, yet not necessarily representative view as well, since these students may have more difficulty parking than on average. You know how it is when you come back from a free period. How then would you obtain a random sample? The best way would be to ask the registrar of all students, would be Mrs. O'Brien, to determine your sample size. Randomly select every 10th or 30th student from the list, contact each of those students and ask for his or her views. Researchers have noted, however, that one problem with polls is that even those conducted using random samples may not provide the accurate data needed to illuminate political opinions and behaviors. Part of the problem is that randomization can only go so far. One standard method for conducting telephone surveys is to use random digit dialing of telephones. Some polling organizations still exclude cellular lines for their population, although most major polling organizations now include cell phone users too in order to create an accurate sample of Americans. Today, more than 20% of the U.S. population relies exclusively on cell phones and has no landlines. People who rely exclusively on landlines are likely to be older than the celly-onlys, which is referred to people that only have cell phones, like most of us. Indeed, one study found that 33% of young adults aged 18 to 29 years lived in cell-only households. And some individuals who eliminated landlines from their homes do so to save money. In fact, in 2008, adults living in poverty were nearly twice as likely to rely on cell phones exclusively compared with those with higher incomes. But even those polling organizations that include cell phone subscribers face a high rate of non-response because of the nearly universal use of caller ID and the transportable nature of cell phones that make their owners. In fact, one study found that those who are willing to respond to pollsters' questions are more politically engaged than those who hit ignore. One way pollsters attempt to address these types of concerns is through the use of quota sampling, a more scientifically sophisticated method of sampling than random sampling. A pollster using this method structures the sample so that it is representative of the characteristics of the target population. So let's say that your mother decides that she wants to run for Town of Union Supervisor, and you would like to conduct a poll that measures opinions on her among various constituencies. From census data, you learn that our town, I'm just throwing out numbers here, this is not correct, I'm just throwing out numbers. You learn that our town is 40% white, 35% African American, 20% Latino, and 5% Asian. Therefore, a Town of Union-wide event, you structure your sample so that it reflects the proportions of the population. With a sample of 200 voters, you would seek to include 80 white respondents, assuming we were using those numbers I threw out earlier, 70 African Americans, 40 Latinos, and 10 Asians. Pollsters routinely rely on quota sampling, though often they may not ask participants about their demographic characteristics until the end of the poll. Another method used to address problems is stratified sampling, in which the national population is divided into fourths, and certain areas within these regions are selected as representative of the national population. Although some organizations still rely on quota sampling, larger organizations and media polls now use stratified sampling, the most reliable form of random sample. Today, nearly every major polling organization relies on U.S. Census data as the basis for their 4 sampling regions. Stratified sampling is the basis for much of the public opinion data used by political scientists and other social scientists, in particular the General Social Survey, or GSS, and the National Election Study. As we have seen, to accurately gauge public opinion, pollsters must obtain an accurate sample from the population they are polling. A sample need not be large to reflect the population's views. In fact, most national polling organizations rarely sample more than 1,500 respondents. Most national samples range from 1,000 to 1,500. To poll smaller populations, states or congressional districts, for example, polling organizations routinely use samples of between 300 and 500 respondents. The key is having a sample that accurately reflects the population. Let's say that your political scientist instructor at college offers extra credit if you attend a weekly study group. The group initially convenes immediately after your regular class session. At the conclusion of the study group, the leader asks if this is a convenient time for everyone to meet. Since everyone present has attended the study group, chances are that that time is more convenient for them than it is for other students who did not attend. Perhaps because they have another class immediately after your political science class, or they work during that time period, or they have childcare responsibilities. In other words, the composition of the sample, in this case the students in the study group, will skew the responses to this question. Similarly, if a poll is administered to a non-representative sample of a population, the responses will not accurately reflect the population's views. In selecting a representative sample, pollsters need to pay particular attention to the time of day a poll is administered. Afternoons yield a disproportionate number of mothers with small children and retirees, and evenings may yield more affluent individuals who do not do shift work. And today's telephone technology presents pollsters with even more obstacles. As we have seen, many potential respondents, particularly young people, have opted out of telephone landlines in favor of cell phones, making them a subset of the population that is even more difficult for pollsters to reach. People with caller ID on both cell phones and landlines frequently screen out unknown numbers and those of survey research companies. Internet polls present their own set of obstacles, including the ability of some individuals to complete surveys or vote for their favorite reality show contestant repeatedly. Nonetheless, market research firms, public opinion polling organizations, and even political candidates are increasingly relying on the internet as a survey research tool. Some organizations, such as the Harris Poll Online, offer memberships. Poll respondents can earn rewards for completing surveys that help the organization create a representative sample of their target population. To adjust for problems with sampling, every poll that relies on a sample has a sampling error, which is sometimes called the margin of error, which is a statistical calculation of the difference in results between a poll of a randomly drawn sample and a poll of the entire population. If you didn't catch that, make sure you pause and rewind. Many polls have a sampling error of plus or minus 3 percentage points. This means 3 percentage points should be added and subtracted from the poll results to find the range of the population. All right, so let's look at types of polls. Today, the process of measuring political opinions has evolved drastically from the days of the Literary Digest straw poll or even George Gallup's first successful predictions of the results of presidential elections. Political candidates, parties, and news organizations rely on several types of polls, depending on their goals and objectives. These include tracking polls, push polls, and exit polls. This is an example of a tracking poll. Tracking polls measure changes in public opinion over the course of days, weeks, or months by repeatedly asking respondents the same question and measuring change in opinion. Since the 1992 presidential election, tracking polls have been an important tool, particularly for presidential candidates seeking to glean information about how campaign strategy has affected a public opinion. Tracking polls are usually useful in indicating the effectiveness of the media strategy, the success of a day's worth of campaigning, or whether the campaign has gotten its message across in the most recent news cycle. Push polls are a special type of poll that both attempts to skew public opinion about a candidate and provide information on campaigns about candidate strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes this is done by presenting survey respondents with a hypothetical situation, then asking them to gauge the importance of the hypothetical issue in determining their vote. For example, a push pollster might ask, if you knew that Congressman Fitzgerald lives outside the district, how would that affect your vote? At their best, push polls help gauge voter priorities so that a campaign can better target its message. The campaign can then determine whether to accentuate the message. However, push polls have an unsavory reputation because some campaigns and organizations have used them to smear an opponent using hypothetical scenarios to make baseless accusations against an opponent without having to substantiate the charges. If you look at the one I have up here on the Prezi, for an example, would you be less likely to vote for candidate Y if you knew that he was gay? Nothing to do with it, just finding out information. And obviously, if the person is not gay, then that puts a problem in for the campaign. So these are questions that skew voters' information, and they don't necessarily give out the truth. All right, so next up we have exit polling. Exit polls are conducted at polling places on election day to project the winner of an election before the poll close. New organizations frequently sponsor exit polls, which help them predict the outcome of gubernatorial, which is for a governor, congressional, and presidential elections. Because of exit polls, new organizations can frequently predict the outcome of a given election shortly after the polls have closed. Exit polls also provide the media, candidates, and political parties with information about why voters voted the way they did. Anytime you watch election results, they'll say that 2% of the polling precincts have reported, and that's from your exit polling.